Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings. And big book. Big book that I have been very, very slowly rereading over the course of months now. If I put in a concentrated effort instead of reading something like 3 pages at a time, I could have been finished way sooner. But here we are. A book that I haven't read since I was 15, 16. It's been a long time. I was in my mid-teens. Um, so this is, as I said, a very big book. Um, the final page count before you actually hit all the notes is 418, and it's a trade paperback, which means it's running very close to 8.5 by 11 sized. It's a very heavy piece of nonfiction literary analysis. Now, here's the thing. I was very impressed with this when I was in my mid-teens, because when you're in your mid-teens, you don't read as critically, you don't know as much. We all have our things like that, whether they're fiction or nonfiction or movies or books or music. I really loved Andrew Lloyd Webber when I was 12, and then I grew out of that. And if somebody wants to get into an argument about Andrew Lloyd Webber in the comments, they can feel free. Not that anybody comments, but you know what I'm saying. Moving on. So from the Beast to the Blonde, what we have here is Titania Awakes from 1794 by Henry Fuseli. You are very possibly likely to have heard of and seen his painting, The Nightmare, which is that painting of the woman fainting on a couch and the horse sticking its head in and the weird gremlin thing sitting on her chest. Very, very melodramatic and overused in popular culture, I'll be frank with you. The thing about Fuseli was that he was a very, fairy tale-y type painter, so this is appropriate going even beyond the subject matter, which, A Midsummer Night's Dream is very much a fairy tale. It derives out of many aspects of the traditions of the fairy tale. It has, fairies in it, haha. But, so it's a perfectly adequate cover. But the thing about this book is there's a lot more to this than just saying, here is a fairy tale, here's Cinderella, let's analyze Cinderella as she was told by Charles Perrault, here's Cinderella as told by the Brothers Grimm, here's Cinderella as told by Walt Disney, now let's, compare and contrast. It's much more than that, this book. And it is worth reading, even if you disagree with every couple of paragraphs, you find yourself saying, why would you say that? That's inaccurate or not an entirely valid thing, because you are pushing too far, you're overanalyzing, because it's one of the faults that I feel she has in this book. I haven't really read anything else that she's done, but one of the problems with this book, and I did really love this book the first time I read it, but one of the problems with it is that she has a tendency to just keep on going forward with the analysis, whether or not, you might think she's gone a little too far. But let's go on with this a little. So here is a picture taken out of the Decameron of Giovanni Boccaccio depicted sitting outside a circle of storytellers. The thing about From the Beast to the Blonde, it's subtitled On Fairy Tales and Their Tellers. And that's because fairy tales, as she does rightly point out, are very much seen as a domain of old women. They're seen as the domain of Mother Goose, of grandma, of your nurse, your nanny, or, possibly even your mother. But the point is that they're very much seen as stories that are told by women to children, especially to little girls. And there's a complication with fairy tales because so many collections of fairy tales Charles Perrault is a man, and he collected these tales and said, "Here are stories as told by women that I, a man, shall tell you." The brothers Grimm were two men, and they collected the fairy tales and then passed them on. And this is here for the purpose of talking about this section of the book, was at least partly about the way that fairy tales made their way out of oral tradition and into the world of being proper art was through the hands of men. There's a lot of feminist text in this book. There's a lot of discussion about women's literary issues. I mean, certainly there's a discussion about women's rights and freedoms and enforced marriages and fear of rape and all of those things that will naturally fall under the auspices of talking about fairy tales. But when you talk about the art of the storyteller, the art of telling these stories, you're talking about stories that were told by women. This is off of the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo's depiction of the Sibyl, not Sybil Shepherd, the Sibyl, which was kind of a scary ancient Roman fortune-telling, you know, divinely inspired or possibly vaguely demonic. It really depends on the source you're going for. Predictor of the future and all-round wise woman. And that you have these stories that come out of the Sibylline tradition of, a very wise woman telling truths. You have the cult of Saint Anne, because the thing is that of course Jesus was born without sin, his mother was a virgin, blah blah blah, but a lot of people felt that if Mary was, born from a regular sinful two people having sex, well then, Jesus would still be tainted, so they decided Mary was a virgin birth too and created a whole thing about that. And so Saint Anne, Mary's mother, developed a kind of a cult around her for literate women, because she was supposedly the one who had taught Mary and Jesus to read, and became a kind of a symbol for women having the ability to write and be educated and so on and so forth, at least if you go back to the 17th, 16th centuries. But the thing is that you have that aspect where you're describing and showing women as bearers of wisdom and all that, but at the same time, you have, the crone storyteller, as I was just saying, and then you have the counterpart of these women who don't shut up, of these elderly crones who babble in a corner and who just don't stop talking endlessly because, women are horrible talkers and ought to be ashamed of themselves, as well we know. I know I am. The thing is that you have these two sides of things. Whether it's the wise old woman storyteller whose wisdom a man has managed to rescue before it got lost because this is purely oral storytelling, or whether it is somebody pulling stories from a woman who just keeps on talking and talking endlessly. These two things, these two concepts are at loggerheads but still get translated through a male speaker, a male translator. And that's a large portion of the first part of the book, is just about people who tell the stories. Whether it was French noblewomen who wrote their own fairy tales that have since fallen off the map, whether it was Brothers Grimm and Charles Perrault, whether it was people's grandmothers or aunts, or, however these storytellers came about. The second half of the book, though, starts to go into the actual stories. And it talks about the ones we all know. It talks about Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty and Snow White and all of that stuff about blonde hair, which we've all heard a million times. Talking about blonde hair and how people are seen as beautiful or not beautiful in popular culture is not a new topic of discussion, not an exciting topic of discussion, not even in the mid-90s when this book was published. But you have some less-known ones, like Donkey Skin, Podan, pardon me, which was one of Charles Perrault's stories in which a young woman, in which a princess, the king promises the king promises his dying wife that he will never marry anyone less beautiful than his beautiful dying wife, and as his daughter grows up, he realizes that the only woman he knows who's as beautiful as his wife is his daughter, and so he says, "Hey everybody, I'm going to marry my daughter," and his daughter freaks out about this, and there's a whole bunch of stuff involving a donkey that poops gold. Anyway, so she runs away and winds up married to a prince, and the king shows up and says, "Wow, I was nuts. I should never have done that." And everybody lives happily ever after. The thing about these, though, is that we get a lot of talk about saints who have to hide from their fathers who are trying to make them marry, because a large number of female saints are women who are trying to get out of marrying some pagan guy because they have given their souls over to Christ, and then somebody stabs them to death because how dare they, and then, there's a miracle and everybody goes, woo, that's actually a saint, woo. There's a large percentage of the female saints that are basically that story. And you have those discussions, you have talk about folk tales that are not seen as fairy tales. There's the interweaving and interplay between what was popular culture in the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, the interplay between that and fairy tales, the interplay between how we see things as a culture overall, and how that affects and plays with and interacts with fairy tales, because fairy tales do change. We all know this because we all know what Disney did to the fairy tales. Frankly, I think much to the benefit of many of those fairy tales. I'm looking at you, Hans Christian Andersen, with your horrifying Little Mermaid. And you get these stories of the Virgin Martyr Uncumber, which I kind of brought up because of my Fifth Business thing, which talks about Uncumber at one point in it, of a female saint who wants to avoid an unwanted marriage, and she spontaneously grows a beard and then gets crucified because that's what you do, apparently. But there's interplay because miracle stories, Christian tales of saints, often bear a shocking resemblance to certain fairy tales. And as I said, there's an interplay there. And it's an interplay that she talks about, and it's very, very interesting. But she goes too far. And I will caution anyone who starts reading this that she does. And she does it when she's tracing, for example, the origin of the concept of the stork in popular culture in relation to babies, and how the stork moved from being a symbol of health to being a symbol of disease, to being a symbol of something that takes out the trash, to being that thing that brings babies because we don't want to tell people where babies actually come from, until finally people started putting it on the side of, diaper disposal bins. And the thing is, she says, and look at that, it's a return to the stork as a disposer of trash. And no, that's not it. Just because somebody says, ooh, storks have to do with babies and dirty diapers have to do with babies, so let's put a stork on the side of it to show that this has to do with babies, doesn't mean that it's moving back to the disposing of trash concept. And she does that a lot. And I don't have enough time to go into any more of these, so you'll just have to read the book to find out if you're really, really interested. So I'm giving you kind of a mixed review, I suppose. Very interesting, well worth reading, but at the same time, and I'll see you all next week.